Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. Today's video is I've called it a classic or retro sci-fi classic retrospective, and it's a show that I don't know that it really is a classic or that anybody involved with it would call it a classic. It's been on my radar to do for a little while, and last week I was just looking at the things I've got planned for the channel and I discovered that it is terrifyingly, absolutely terrifyingly, 25 years since this show aired its last episode. 25 years. Now, there was a time in the early years of this series that I was briefly obsessed with it because it sort of touched a nerve in me. It's a bit Doctor Who-ish about a group of people travelling to different places and being sort of lost and not able to get back where they came from, and the sort of randomness of where they went. The show is called Sliders, by the way. I'll get around to it in the end. A show which was never hugely popular, never had a massive audience, but still managed to tick over for 5 seasons, airing its last episode in February 2000. So it's well over 25 years since this show ended. And watching the first couple of series in particular, which is where my interest in the series lies, seems like yesterday. So let's fire up our timer, open up the wormhole, and talk about Sliders. Sliders. Hello, welcome back. My name is Paul Mount, Internet, in case you didn't know. Sliders. This is a fascinating show which has sort of been pushed over or slipped away or slid away into the corners of people's memories of cult TV. This was a show that arrived in the late 1990s, and I think if you watch it now, you can tell it's a show from the 1990s. It has that sort of vibe about it. But as I mentioned in the preamble, it's a show that I was briefly obsessed with because I loved the concept of it. I think it's a really interesting concept. This came along before multiverses and parallel universes and other worlds and all these sorts of things that we're now sick to death of in Marvel and even Doctor Who and all these shows that fascinate themselves with alternative worlds and things. But Sliders didn't do it first. Science fiction, literary science fiction, comic science fiction, and even some TV science fiction. They've been doing this stuff for ages. But I think Sliders was one of the first shows that was based almost completely around the concept of travelling to other dimensions and parallel worlds. The show was created by Tracy Torme, who is the son of Mel Torme, quite a popular entertainer of the, I'm saying, 40s, 50s into the 60s. And he executive produced the show along with Robert K. Weiss, Leslie Beltzberg, John Landis, and David Peckinpah, and several others. And I think people like Bill Dial and Alan Barnett were executive producers at various times of the show's often tumultuous production history. The show's first 3 seasons, comprising 48 episodes, just over half the show's total run, were broadcast on Fox, where it did have a troubled history because it was a show that had an audience, not a massive audience. Fox were aware of its minor popularity, but in a similar fashion to Firefly, Joss Whedon's series a few years later, they didn't really know what to do with it. They didn't quite understand how it worked and why it worked, and they had little regard for the show's storytelling order in terms of narrative. Episodes were made to be shown in a certain order. Some episodes had cliffhangers that led into the next episode. Fox, however, felt, no, we want to schedule them differently because this episode's more spectacular, or this one's more action-packed, this is more interesting. So the show's continuity is wobbly at best. If you're not familiar with the series, I remember watching the pilot episode probably about 1996 by the time it came over here on Sky, I think. The concept of the show is about a group of people who are able to travel through a wormhole to parallel Earths, where things are very much like they are on our Earth, but very slightly different. There are cultural differences, environmental differences, things that differentiate the worlds that our characters travel to from the world that they come from. The lead character is Quinn Mallory. He's played by Jerry O'Connell, and he is a sort of high school scientist who has, in his basement laboratory, created a device, a timer device, that opens up a wormhole that allows him and any other people who happen to be with him to travel through this wormhole. They're sucked into this wormhole and spat out the other side. Accompanying Quinn on his travels when he activates the timing device are Wade Wells, played by Sabrina Lloyd. She is not exactly Quinn's girlfriend, but they have a sort of a will they won't they thing between them. And also, adding the show's cast a bit of gravitas, is science professor Maximilian Arturo, what a fantastic name, played by John Rhys Davies, big, strong, powerful Welsh actor who gives the show a real quirky punch. I suppose in a way he's the show's doctor type figure, although he doesn't lead the pack. He's not the person who's created the device. He is the slightly eccentric character, quite bullish, quite authoritative, the one who tries to lead the group down the right path. In the pilot episode, the group inadvertently bring along with them a soul singer called Rembrandt Brown, Crying Man. He is, I suppose, a slightly suspect cliche of soul singers from the 60s and 70s, like one of the Drifters, something like that. But I think when you watch the show now, you will think, oh, he's a bit of a sort of cliche black character. He's played by Cleveland Derricks, who was the only member of the cast to survive the entire run of the series. He was in every episode. He was there right to the bitter end. And as you see, there were lots of bizarre, baffling cast changes and conglomerations of characters throughout the series. I remember watching the pilot episode, which runs for about 80-90 minutes, absolutely thrilled by this, because it did something in places similar to Time Slip, the 1970s kids show, which I've done videos about recently, particularly in one slide. Quinn and his gang are using the timer to try and get back to their Earth, and at one point they arrive in San Francisco, which is frozen, and I remember quite clearly and vividly the excitement of seeing them suddenly arriving in this frozen landscape. Rembrandt the Crying Man, from my memory, is driving a Cadillac or something, and they're in this frozen Cadillac, and you see some quite well visualized FXs of the frozen Golden Gate Bridge and the city covered in ice and so on. And the whole first pilot episode eventually sees them arriving in an America which has been taken over by Russia, and they get involved with the resistance, and all the time they've got this timing device, and the timing device opens at specific times, and they've got to be ready to slide when the device is ready to slide. Sometimes they can be there for hours, minutes, sometimes days until the next wormhole opens. And that's the dramatic conceit that sort of powers the series, as they have adventures in these slightly different worlds, but all the time they've got to come together again to be back together in time to slide on to the next world. And for the first 2 seasons of the show, I was absolutely enraptured by this. I thought this was a terrific idea because I liked the cast. They were all really likeable people. Quinn, played by Jerry O'Connell, had this youthful sort of exuberance about him. He created this incredible scientific device. And he had a bit like the Doctor in the TARDIS, couldn't quite control it. And then you had Arturo, Maximilian Arturo, who was very much the patrician sort of figure, gathering these people together. You had Wade, who was slightly elfin look about her, and Rembrandt the Crying Man, who just wanted to get home. And it was a really nice team of people, a nice cast of people who worked well together. The first season, I think it might have been a mid-season replacement, as they call them, a show that arrives to replace something else which hasn't worked. That consisted of 10 episodes. That really set up the idea of the series. And I think for me, although the show offered some high concept ideas in terms of sci-fi things, you had episodes where a pulsar is about to destroy the human race. You would have episodes where a pandemic had raged across the world, quite prescient that one. Episodes where an asteroid was going to destroy the world. But the episodes that I found most interesting were those where they arrived in a world which was just slightly different and had very slight cultural differences. For example, in the first season, you had an episode called Summer of Love, where they arrived in a world where the Summer of Love from the 1960s had never ended, and people still had that sort of slightly hippie, carefree sensibility. Then there was another episode, Eggheads, where intellectualism was prided over athleticism and how our characters fitted into that and the jeopardy that they got involved with. The show couldn't avoid some of those inevitable cliches, I suppose. There was an episode in which men were the weaker sex and women were dominant. Ooh, edgy. And an episode called Luck of the Draw, which was an interesting twist on the idea of lotteries, because I think this was quite popular at the time because lotteries were big in America and the lottery was just arriving in the UK. The idea that people would win the lottery would be incredible. They'd win massive amounts of money, but at the cost of their own lives, because lottery winners then forfeited their lives. The first and second seasons were filmed in Vancouver, and as a result they do have that slightly rainy look. If you remember those early seasons of The X-Files where Mulder and Scully were always walking around with umbrellas because it was pouring down with rain. And Sliders has that same slightly grey washed out look to it in those first two series, despite the efforts that they made to tell stories in these slightly different worlds. It always looked like rainy Vancouver. And interestingly, they always had a base. Wherever they went in these different worlds, they would always rendezvous or use as their base a hotel in San Francisco called the Chandler Hotel. And that was for a while the base of operations. They would always stay there as their base before they went out exploring and getting involved in adventures and so on. Season 2 of the show, which started in March 1996. The show hadn't been a huge hit, but it did a bit of a following and there was a lot of potential there, so it was renewed for a second series. This broadened the concept slightly. Into the Mystic was set in a world where the occult is much more accepted and much more front and centre than it is on our world. Gillian of the Spirits is set in a world which is anti-technology. El Cid is set in a world where San Francisco has become a huge prison. And quite memorably, the episode In Dino Veritas, which is a post-Jurassic Park story where they land in a world where dinosaurs are hunted in the wild. If you watch this episode now, you will cringe at the dinosaur effects because they are beyond primitive, shall we say. One of the issues with the second season, I think, which became obvious, is that, again, as I mentioned, Fox just moved the episode schedules around, so that narrative arcs built into the stories were thrown aside because Fox would move episodes around. As I recall, the first season ended on a cliffhanger with Quinn being shot. Second season kicked off with an episode which didn't resolve that, and the episode that did resolve, or at least allude to it, was shown later in the season. And this is so frustrating if you're trying to build an interesting ongoing story with characters and there are repercussions and consequences to the things they do and the places they go. That's thrown out the window if the network suddenly decides, actually, you want to put that episode higher up in the running order and move that round. So it just throws everything up in the air. And this is very much what happened to Sliders again and again throughout its history. These are the first two series that I remember most fondly of Sliders. Now, normally when I do these retrospectives, I go back and watch a few episodes to remind myself of the series. I haven't done that with this because those first two series, even though they're 30 years old, I remember them quite fondly, and I remember the excitement that I felt about this series because I felt that this had so much potential to tell so many really interesting stories, fascinating stories about worlds that could have been or could be, the slight variations. And it's those stories that I particularly enjoyed, where there weren't huge things going on. It was great to see those episodes where there was an asteroid coming towards the Earth in the sky, but obviously the visual effects budget was a bit more limited, so you couldn't have that much spectacle, and it was the early days of CGI, so things were a little bit more primitive than they are today. But the stories that I really enjoyed were those character-based ones, because I liked the characters and seeing how they dealt with these slightly different worlds. And of course, because they were travelling to alternative worlds, they would very often meet the alternative world versions of themselves. Can't think of another series that had so many episodes where they met doubles of themselves or doppelgangers of themselves on different worlds. But that makes sense within the context of Sliders because it was a format that allowed that sort of thing to take place and to happen. 1996 is sort of an important year for Sliders because it wasn't doing particularly well, and Fox were umming and ahhing about renewing it for another series. Now, I don't know if this is an apocryphal story or whether it's actually true. In May 1996, the Doctor Who TV movie aired on Fox. This was a big co-production between Fox and Universal and the BBC. The TV movie starring Paul McGann was going to relaunch Doctor Who on a massive international scale, and if the movie was successful, a series would follow. The film was often described as a backdoor pilot for a TV series, and certainly Philip Segal, who produced it, and Matthew Jacobs, who wrote the script, sort of hoped that it would be a springboard onto a new series that would relaunch Doctor Who and possibly reboot it. I know that the Bible that was prepared for what was proposed to be the series envisaged new versions of Cybermen and retellings of old classic Doctor Who stories. The TV movie aired in May on Fox and didn't do incredibly well, although it did very well in the UK. in the stated disappointed, mainly because it was screened against the series finale of Roseanne, which had always been a massively popular sitcom in America. So the Doctor Who movie, although it posted what will be considered very good numbers today on Fox, didn't do well enough to be recommissioned for a series. And I believe, and as I say, this is the part that I feel may be apocryphal, it was suggested that Fox were umming and ahhing about whether to go forward with a Doctor Who series or go forward with a third series of Sliders. And I think my understanding is that on the basis that Sliders was an already established show on Fox with a following, they would commission a third series of that, go forward with that, rather than proceed with a series based on a pilot which hadn't done very well and which wasn't known in America at that time. So Sliders was granted a third series. Series went into production, started in September 1996 with an increased episode order of 25 and an increased budget, and it moved over to Los Angeles for filming, so it immediately looks brighter and bigger and sunnier. Unfortunately, the show's direction was influenced by cinema trends at the time, and I don't know if this was a decision made by the producers or a request made by Fox, but the episodes suddenly started riffing off recent hit films. Suddenly the show did look a bit more expensive. The very first episode that was screened, although it wasn't the one that was intended to be the first one of the series, was called Rules of the Game, which saw our Slider heroes in an environment where there was a massive war game going on. It was full of explosions and gunfights and chases and all the stuff that the show hadn't really done before on a grand scale because the budget wasn't there. And I remember watching this, I remember really looking forward to season 3 starting, and I remember watching this first episode and thinking, it doesn't have the same depth to it, I suppose. And that's what I liked about the original series. I'd liked the characters, and I'd liked the contrast of the slightly different worlds and seeing them in the slightly different worlds. Now all of a sudden it was about explosions and effects and spectacle, and the characters seemed suddenly a bit less engaging. We had an episode that riffed on Twisters, on a tornado world. We had a desert world episode. We had another episode where magic ruled the planet. We had an episode where men became pregnant. We had an episode where commercialism had run rampant. And some of those episodes worked quite well because they were more character-based and based on speculative ideas that weren't so extreme from the world that we live in today. I think the turning point for the show, however, was somewhere in the middle of the series with a two-part story, Exodus, where the Sliders landed in a world which is going to be evacuated because a pulsar is going to wipe out all life on Earth. This is where the fracturing of the cast begins. John Rhys-Davies, who'd been disillusioned with scripts for some time, decided he wanted to be written out of the show. So I think he actually described the scripts at one point as some of the worst he'd ever read. And I know he was quite vociferous and outspoken about the show years later, and at conventions he would often say all the writers were doing was taking ideas from recent films and just grafting these characters into them. They were just looting big screen trends, and that's quite evident looking at series 3. So he wanted to be written out. Earlier in the series there had been some suggestion that he was ill, and he was written out in the two-parter Exodus. Although again, typically Fox, with their obsession with moving episodes around, they moved an earlier episode with him still in it to later in the season, so it had to be told as a flashback. As season 3 wore on, things didn't really get any better. You had episodes of the Planet of Zombies, you had an episode with body controlling parasites, another dino episode, and you had an episode which was a complete rip-off of the island of Dr. Moreau. So season 3 limped to its end, hadn't fared particularly well in the ratings, and Fox swung the axe. However, Sci-Fi Channel, which at the time I think was probably a bit more proactive in terms of the shows that it actually made, they grabbed the rights to the show and they pulled it in for a 4th season. By now, however, Sabrina Lloyd had decided she'd had enough of the show. In the 3rd series, a new character had been introduced, played by Carrie Wurra. I best remember her from the film Eight-Legged Freaks. Apparently there was some friction between the two actresses. Apparently Carrie Wurra made some slightly sarcastic comment about Wade Wells in a relationship with one of the crew, and they just didn't particularly hit it off. And I think, although that was sort of brushed under the carpet at the time, I think it's since been clarified that the two didn't really get on. So Sabrina Lloyd decided to leave the show. This left us now with just two of the original Sliders, Jerry O'Connell and Cleveland Derricks. Season 4 on the Sci-Fi channel, this ran to 22 episodes that began in June 1998. There was a bit of a gap between season 3 and 4. This picked up on one of the more interesting arcs from the second season, where the Sliders had landed on an Earth which had been invaded by an alien species called the Cro-Mags, whose plan was to spread across all the parallel worlds and take over every parallel version of Earth. This had not really been referenced in season 3, but on the Sci-Fi channel, that was put a bit more front and centre. There was a regular sort of threat that the Sliders encountered as they travelled on different worlds. They discovered that the Cro-Mags were there in different forms. Season 4 ploughed a similar furrow, I suppose, to season 3. I think the budget was slightly reduced, but the shows still largely followed cinematic trends and went for certain spectacular ideas. There were, however, episodes which were quite interesting about religion. There was one about a world obsessed with virtual reality. The Cro-Mags, as I said, returned in several episodes. There was an episode about a world bedeviled by acid rain. And during the series, we had the introduction of a new character where it was revealed that Quinn had a brother, Colin, who's actually played by Jerry's brother, Charlie O'Connell, who then became a member of the cast. The show trundled along for another 22 episodes. Presumably expectations in terms of ratings and reception and so on were different on the Sci-Fi channel, and it was renewed until a fifth and what turned out to be final season. Things changed here, however. Jerry O'Connell felt that the show had now moved so far away from the original concept of the show that he felt it was time for him to move on. Here's where things get slightly silly, even by the standards of a Sci-Fi show. Like Sliders, in the opening episode of the 5th season, Quinn's brother Colin just disappears. He's lost in the void somewhere. Quinn is merged with the Quinn of the world that they've slid into, and he becomes a new version of Quinn, who's called Mallory. He's played by a new actor, Robert Floyd. And the group are now joined by a new character, Dr. Diana Davis, played by Tembi Locke. She's a scientist who helps them to reverse the process and try and get the original Quinn back. This is the cast that carried the show on to the end of the season, its 18th and final episode, which aired in February 2000. The running theme of the battle against the Cro-Mags continued throughout the season, and ultimately the group discover a contagious virus which is deadly to the Cro-Mags. The timer itself is destroyed. Eventually the group find that they can only send one of their number back to Earth Prime, as it's called. Rembrandt injects himself with the virus and jumps through, hoping to find himself back on Earth Prime with the rest of the cast, unsure of his fate. And that's how the show ended. That was a sort of cliffhanger ending, which is fairly typical of a show which had been studied with cliffhangers that had been compromised by changed episode running orders and so on, and some mishandled ideas. I didn't see series 4 or 5, I will put my hand up, because by then the show had moved beyond my interest. It had lost the things that had pulled me into it in the first place. All the changes of cast and some of the slightly extreme story ideas, it had become focused on things that didn't interest me as much as it did at the beginning. When I was interested in these characters, I liked these characters, and I liked their interaction, and I liked some of the worlds that they went to, which weren't too extreme, which were quite thought-provoking. And that's when Sliders was at its best, when it was thought-provoking, when it was telling stories that made you think, wow, what if the world was like that, and we're not so far away from a world that is like that. And that's when I thought Sliders was at its strongest. I think I might have seen 1 or 2 episodes from season 4, but I seem to recall that because of the budget reductions, you would see reuses of the same backlot locations and much smaller casts, and there were less action sequences, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. By now, the cast had changed so much that I didn't have a connection with the new characters. I didn't really bond with Carrie Wurra's character. And certainly when Charlie O'Connell came in, it all became a bit silly and fanciful and desperate to keep itself together, when it was quite clear that the thing was really falling apart. And certainly series 3 I lost interest in, because it became very superficial, and it became about the spectacle, and it became about the bigger ideas rather than the ideas that allowed the characters to experience things and grow as characters. So Sliders bowed out in February 2000, pretty much unloved, I think. Which is a shame, because, as I said, those first 2 series, filmed in Vancouver for all their drizzliness, I think had a sense of imagination to them. That it wasn't about the spectacle, it wasn't about showing the aliens, it wasn't about big science fiction extravaganzas. It was about people experiencing worlds that were a bit like ours, but not quite. And I felt that that was enough, really, for me. And you could do these stories, like the pilot episode with Russia taking over America, and another episode where the American Civil War never happened and the British had retained dominance in America. These are the ideas that I found interesting, and how they navigated those things and how the people that they encountered dealt with them. That's what I found interesting. And when the show went, balls to the wall, action and spectacle in Series 3, it lost a lot. And I know that as Series 3 went along, it became less must-see. And I don't know if I ever got to the end of Series 3, to be honest. Particularly when John Rhys Davies left, it lost a lot of its heart and became half the show it was. Which is a shame, because this is such a good idea, such a simple idea, which obviously has now been explored to death in Marvel and Doctor Who and various other genre shows, Fringe, which have all done the parallel world, alternative universe type thing. So we're all sick to death of it now. But it was a bit of a novelty back in Sliders. To its credit, it did sort of stumble on through 88 episodes for all the faults of its production and the issues surrounding its cast. It had a certain longevity to it, which is quite admirable in a time these days when we're lucky to get a couple of series of 8 episodes of a show. This sort of trotted out quite a lot of episodes. And certainly the first 2 seasons are well worth your time if you can track them down. Sliders died then in 2000. There's often been talk since of it returning. Jerry O'Connell has always said that if Tracy Torme, the creator, would come up with a viable way of bringing it back, he will be on board, because he had a lot of affection for the show. So much so that he had to bail out of the 5th season because he felt that the whole original concept had been compromised so much. But he always said he would come back. Unfortunately, Tracy Torme died a few years ago, and of course nothing ever happened. This idea never came together. And this, I think, is another example of wishful thinking, really, of a show that was never a big hit. And I think it sort of outlived any expectations people may have had of it, certainly after its first couple of seasons. That there's probably no cachet in bringing it back because it isn't a recognisable IP. It wasn't a successful enough IP. It has no resonance, and I know I use that word quite a lot, with the public. It's not like with Doctor Who or Star Trek. It wasn't a title that sank into the public consciousness. It has no real nostalgia value, I suppose, which is a shame because it is a great idea. So that's Sliders, 1995 to 2000. After image. Well, there was a bit of an after image. There was some merchandise. I know all the episodes have been released on DVD and I believe on Blu-ray. I think you can still pick up those box sets. And actually, now I'm talking about the show, I'm going to go straight onto eBay or Amazon after this and see if I can find those first 2 seasons, because I would quite like to watch them again. There was a book, Brad Linkweaver, I think his name is. He wrote a paperback adaptation of the pilot, and he also wrote a sort of episode guide to the best episodes. I did have that first paperback book, but disappeared a while back. There was a short-lived comic series. I think there was a mini-series. And in fact, there was a special Slider Special comic, which I discovered. Slider Special, Deadly Secrets, which came out a few years back. Can't remember anything about it. I'm sure I read it. This will be set during 2nd season. But this is quite nice. I'm quite pleased that I've hung on to this as a bit of Sliders merch. That was pretty much it. There were no other merchandise releases. I would have quite liked a replica timer, the little handset device that Quinn used to hold and shoot out a beam. And it was quite nice. The visual effect of the wormhole opening was quite nice, and they'd be sucked into it. And I quite liked the way that they would all crash out in a tumble and jumble of arms and legs, aching from landing on the ground, having been spat out by the wormhole. So that's the only after image that the show has. And as I say, unfortunately, over the years, it's just been forgotten, I suppose, which is a shame because it was a nice idea that wasn't handled as well as it should have been. So that's Sliders. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a bit of a rattle through the history of Sliders and its various boggling cast changes and concepts to try and keep the thing together. If you remember watching Sliders, I'd love to know what your memories of it are, because as I said, I don't think it's a show that has a massive fan following in the way that many of the shows I've talked about here have. So I would love to know if you remember the show, any particular episodes that you enjoyed, and anything else to do with the show that you remember. So leave a comment down below. Let me know what your memories of Sliders are. Right, thank you for watching. I will see you soon Like and subscribe if you are new. If you want a t-shirt, Keep Taking the Stuff t-shirt, you'd look a right Bobby Dazzler in one of these. You know you would. I will leave a link down below where you can get hold of one for a bloody reasonable price. So I'm done. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.